Okay, welcome back, everyone. It is the Water, Wetlands, and Watershed Seminar. It's fall 2021. It's now November, so November 3rd. And today we are lucky enough to have with us Dr. Tom Bianchi. Dr. Thomas Bianchi is the John and Beverly Thompson Endowed Chair of Geological Sciences here in the Department of Geosciences at UF. That's your new name, right? Department of Geosciences, right? And his research focuses on organic geochemistry, biogeochemistry of aquatic food chains, and carbon cycling in estuarine and coastal ecosystems, which is, I think, what we'll hear mostly about today. He's worked in estuarine systems around the world, but has a particular focus on the Mississippi River and the Louisiana shelf system. He's published over 80 articles in refereed journals and was a co-lead editor for a book called Biogeochemistry of Gulf of Mexico Estuaries. And he also came out with a really interesting book recently, it seems recent anyway, called Deltas and Humans, a long relationship now threatened by global change, which was put out by Oxford University Press. Dr. Bianchi has also published recently on the history of biogeochemistry in a really nice article that came out. I can't remember if it was this year or last year because time has all sort of melted together, but a really long look back at how science of biogeochemistry has developed. So it's a really great one to for all students and faculty, just as a reminder of where the roots of this discipline came from. And particularly now as we think about climate change and where we're going with biogeochemistry. So with that, Tom, also a good friend, and I appreciate you doing the seminar for us. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, David. Sherilyn, thanks for inviting me. I gave a talk at the Wetlands Institute. I guess maybe it's been 7 or 8 years now. So it's nice to be back. I'm going.
You showed us the Deltas book and the illustrations that, or the woodcuts, right? That your wife did for the.
That's right. Yeah, you remember that. Okay, very good. You're going to get points for that, David.
Well, yeah. So awesome.
All right. So can you see the title slide, David?
Yeah, everything looks great.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So as David said, I'm going to talk to you about carbon cycling at these interfaces that many of us work on from wetlands and lakes and variety of different systems. And basically, let me see how I can get this to, why is it not advancing? Okay.
I think if you click on, so you see your red dot, if you click on in there, it should.
Okay, got you. Thanks. I guess I hadn't done that initially. All right, thanks, David. Yeah, so these are the agencies that have funded us for a number of years now. It's and basically the folks that have done all the work, just give certainly a call out to them. You might recognize this person here. Elise Morrison was a postdoc with me, and she's now assistant professor in engineering, and a couple of other people and where they're located now as ex-PhD students and postdocs. So just a quick outline will be looking at the some of the carbon budgets in these critical zones or these interfaces that are important in biogeochemistry. Some of the sort of trends in that we're seeing across the globe with carbon dynamics as related to human pressures. And then just sort of finish with a few slides on some things we've been working on with marsh mangrove systems, just again, very brief. So let's start with the first category. And this is just to show you some work we did a while back looking at burial in the global ocean. You can see this in teragrams, grams of carbon per year, and you can see that pretty much the coastal ocean is where over 80% of all the carbon in the entire ocean gets buried. So it's a really important area for global models and how we look at the fate of carbon as it interfaces between the ocean and continents. And you can see these various categories. I'll talk a little bit about this one as well. Fjords being kind of an interesting one that's now more in the crosshairs with climate warming and essentially thawing in the Arctic system. So what is it that controls carbon burial, right? And it just mentioned that over 86% or whatever is buried in these coastal margins. Lots of people have contributed to that. These are really the major 6 reasons or pathways that you can bury carbon. A high sedimentation rate, that is this raining of material coming into the sediments, is one factor. That makes sense. Another one is redox. If you have low oxygen, that tends to slow the microbes down. Surface area, aggregates, they create nooks and crannies that interfere with exoenzymes. Selective preservation based on the biochemical properties, that would be essentially the difference between the composition of a diatom and the composition of higher plant leaves. Some of them have more lignocellulose that are tougher for microbes to break down. Geopolymerization, these are things that happen outside the cell, where you can have this condensation reactions where fragments of molecules can link up and create these large macromolecular things that go into humic materials. And then the final one, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these, but the final one that we've been very interested in is this sorption to iron. So iron cycling has become quite important in preserving organic matter on the more oxidized forms, that is the iron oxyhydroxides. So this is just some work that, again, we did back a while, back in 2013. And essentially what this does, this just shows the pre-industrial and present day. And essentially the idea is that if you look at pre-industrial present day, that the rate of uptake by the coastal ocean has obviously gone up, no surprise there. Some of this is due not only to higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, but also nutrient inputs to the coastal ocean. So the more nutrient inputs you put, the more the phytoplankton get activated, the more they can draw CO2 down. And it's really tough to work in coastal systems because oceanographers, people who work in coastal environments, are always jealous of the open ocean people because they have these large, beautiful, sort of homogeneous systems like the Pacific and the Atlantic that they can carry over a lot of overlap with patterns because things tend to happen slower, relatively speaking. Of course, some things happen quickly. But if you look, we're looking at estuaries in the United States in recent work, and this just shows you some of the average burial rate, organic deposition rate, and burial rate across all of these different systems. But you can see that you really need to divide things into what type of estuary. All right, so the open ocean is pretty much the open ocean, whether you're in the Pacific, the Indian, or the Atlantic. But in these coastal systems, when people say, I work on estuaries, well, it depends. Are you working on a fjord? Are you working in a delta front estuary? Are you working on a coastal plain? Really, really divergent in their behavior. So another thing, that's some of the margin effects in terms of the complexity of things and what controls carbon burial. If you look at the pathway from what we call source to sink, the source of where particles come from, right? Eroding, chemical weathering, physical weathering of mountains, out to the floodplain, through the estuaries, out to the coastal ocean. There are lots and lots of different dynamics going on here in terms of transformations of dissolved organic matter and particulate matter to gaseous phases and greenhouse gases and so on. So this aquatic continuum, if we look at, as I said, from the higher elevation regions out to the coastal floodplains and then to the areas where we see wetlands and estuaries and the coastal margin where we bury much of the carbon in the ocean, this is changing dramatically, obviously, in the Anthropocene. One of the interesting things that I think is important to keep in mind, a lot of the people are interested in ecology, nutrients, management, things like that. But one of the things I always sort of try to impress on people that work with me are the larger, stepping back and thinking of the larger picture that the coastal management on the west coast of the US, and you happen to be working coastal management on the east coast, these are the settings, that the radically different settings that you're sitting in. In active margins, particularly in steep margins like Taiwan, where you have these really high mountains that rapidly shunt to the coastline, you can have large inputs of rapid input from the mountains to the coastal zone, okay? And again, this would be not that different in some areas up in the northwest of US. And with that, you get lots of kerogen, deep sort of old carbon that's in this, that's stored in the rocks because of this mass wasting that can go on because of these steep gradients. Now, if you come out to the East Coast or the Gulf Coast, essentially you have the floodplain and more time for this material to sort of get resuspended and move along, and it eventually works its way out to the coastal margin. So this is a passive margin. This is an active margin that's typically more related to tectonic activity. So why do we care? Well, again, if you're looking at carbon cycling, these are the kinds of larger drivers of the type of ancient material that can get put into the carbon pool, and sort of the modern material, such as the Amazon floodplain, the Mississippi floodplain, that gradually works out. And you get a lot of modern and mixed terrestrial, where here you get much more of this older stored material that shunts its way to the coast. Another thing that I'll be talking about are these hotspots. And so what's sort of emerged in this aquatic continuum are a series of places where a lot of scientists are focusing. You've heard about blue carbon, right? Marshes and mangroves. River deltas have always been important. They're the major players that drain the continents to the coast. Fjords are interesting now, as I'll bring up. And then again, as it relates to some of these permafrost regions that are undergoing thawing and what that means for carbon cycling. I won't be talking about upwelling, so I'll be staying along the coastline here. So one final thing in my sort of general intro before we get into some specific examples are, this idea of critical zone dynamics. Okay, this is something that NSF has picked up on for some years, and a lot of younger faculty use this language much more than when I was their age. So this is very much a part of it. And it sort of originated from the soil communities, where you can actually really draw a line in the soil much easier in terms of looking at where the barriers are in a particular terrestrial ecosystem. It's not quite as easy in aquatic systems because water is moving, things are changing much more. But we are starting to see more zones defined based on where we can focus on these particular critical zones, such as deltas, such as essentially river zones, right? Where rivers come to meet. Some of these dam regions where dams have been constructed are really, really intense interfaces, the kinds of things that you might see in a terrestrial system. And again, they're a little bit different than ecotones. Ecotones have been around for a long time. People, ecologists have known about that. But this, again, is more in relation to human impacts. And these are just a few examples of that. You can see reservoirs where you have these high levels of productivity because you're slowing down the water and you're allowing material to sediment and phytoplankton to get more light. River confluences where you have these extreme gradients of mud and algae coming together. River plumes, you can see the classic brown, green, and blue that you move out from sediments to higher productivity to out to the blue waters where you have more limited nutrients. So these are the kinds of, sort of aquatic critical zones that have been important. And then the final thing I just mentioned, which I will only mention here, but these zones are prone to what we call priming. And it's another concept that comes from soils. And priming, the idea behind this is that you can take aquatic dissolved organic carbon, that from phytoplankton, and that may come in contact with terrestrial material. And because this is so highly degradable and available to microbes, it can actually activate terrestrial material or make it more consumable in some way. And it's always been somewhat of a mystery as to how this happens. To have bacteria take up terrestrial material more effectively than if it had not come in contact with algae. And published a paper where I think, where essentially I propose that there are these zones where we should go look for priming in aquatic systems, because as I said, most of it was really in the soils where it was much more firmly established. So long story short, that's a whole seminar in itself, and the aquatic systems coming along, and people are finding it, but it's not that easy to find, and it has to, the experiments have to be very strictly constructed. So I guess I do have one more that's sort of broad in terms of this big picture. The other thing that's happening is organisms are on the move because of global warming. This is just something that's hypothetical from the Nature Conservancy. It doesn't have any quantification value to it, but it gives you the general idea. And of course, on land, things are going to respond to warming temperatures more than in water, because water is going to be more buffered by its heat latency. But we do see it. We are seeing it in coastal waters. The Gulf of Maine is one of the most rapidly warming bodies in the world because of its interaction with the Labrador Current and how that's being affected by warming. And of course, most people could care less about benthos, critters that are crawling in the sediments, but they do care if it's a lobster, and they do care if it's a king crab, and things like that suddenly show up on the radar because they're moving north. And they're moving north because the waters in the Gulf of Maine are just too warm. Well, that's all sort of a whole other issue that is not within my wheelhouse. There are lots of people looking at biodiversity and genetic adaptations and so on. But I'm going to bring it up in a different way as it relates to how these organisms move and their changes with what that might mean to carbon burial. Because when big organisms move like this, their bioturbation may affect redox and carbon burial. Okay, and that's what you see here. We published a recent paper that speculates and sets the scene for how you can actually start moving organisms as they adapt to warming. And okay, again, as I said, it's a biodiversity question, but it's also, in my mind, a question in this coastal ocean where we bury greater than 80% of the carbon burial. If you start changing the mixing dynamics from polychaetes and bivalves and arthropods as they reposition themselves, what does that do to the steady state of carbon burial in different systems? And I think that's something that needs to be considered beyond biodiversity and beyond some of the interesting genetic adaptations. So here's my first slide where we start getting into some examples. I'll talk a little bit about some deltas, some fjords, some big rivers. And essentially, these are some locations. You can see these red dots where we've worked for the last 20 years or so. So this is a little bit of a tricky one to start with, and I apologize for that. But this is off the Louisiana coast. The Mississippi River comes out here. This is the Mississippi Canyon. So I'm looking at transects that are coming out from these barataria, estuary, or these are sediment samples that we collected, right? Now, if you look at from the river to the canyon, that's what you're looking at here, from the river mouth to the canyon. We're interested in how materials get transported and does it get buried? Does it get returned back to the atmosphere? So you can look at various biomarkers, and again, you don't need to worry about the details of this, but this is a lignin biomarker. And essentially, if you look at this arrow, as you go from the river to the canyon, the total lignin goes down, all right? That's not surprising because lignin comes from terrestrial plants. So you would expect that there would be much more terrestrial organic carbon in these sediments than offshore. But you do see it out there. Here's this arrow is the level of lignin decay. So it's being transported offshore, and as it's being transported, it's being degraded. That in itself was interesting because actually most people don't think lignin can be broken down unless it's on land by fungi. So a lot of these moieties of lignin, once they reach the coastal zone, can be worked on by bacteria. And another interesting thing about these river deltas, again, remember, this is one of my examples of it, of an important interface, right, or critical zone, are what we call mobile muds. Mobile muds are these semi-consolidated muds that do not really become part of the seabed in the traditional way because there's so much sediment coming out from these big rivers that it remains in this fluidized state. Why do we care? That happens to be almost a digester of organic matter in terms of the oxygen, electron acceptors, and things like that. So mobile muds are really important in controlling why lignin can get decomposed like that. If we go to another part of the world where we have big river systems coming out, this is Shanghai, I've been working in China, and you can look at some of these deltaic systems, and actually what's really happened in the Anthropocene is you still have these mobile muds in yellow here, like I just showed you, off the coast of the Yangtze, the Yangtze River here, and the Yellow River comes out up here. But then you get these chunks of mud that are out in the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea that are remnants of old deltas that have eroded due to human intervention here that have released all this mud out to these areas. So we were interested, what is that mud that's been sitting out there because of, again, human effects on the old Yellow River Delta? How is that different than a modern system? This has been worked on land, and then it sort of accumulated out there. And this is sort of where the action is now. Again, Yellow River up here, Yangtze River here. And you get all these different types of mixing regimes. I mean, some fluid muds, mobile muds, all of these different, I won't drag you through this, but there are all of these different mixing regimes in these very dynamic regions. So essentially what we see is that if you look at incubation studies that we did, if you take mud and you incubate this mud, this sort of older mud, and then you incubate this sort of newly active material, you find big differences in essentially in that, 16.8% of the material was decomposed in the new muds, and only about 5.4% in these older muds. So again, it just reflects the idea that these muds, once they've been kind of reworked and the good organic matter has been taken out, they get remobilized. But again, this whole footprint is being impacted by humans. There are lots of dams being built in China. That affects where these mobile muds go. It affects how much of the coastline gets released out there. And again, these are hotspots for organic matter burial. If you look at another global picture in these red areas where we sort of did a survey of what kind of relationships there are with radiocarbon and delc-13. The one thing I just want to point out to you, okay, so minus 26 for those of you who may not know what delc-13 values represent, but that shows a terrestrial signature as opposed to algal. And these more depleted delta-14, the older of these are thousands of years old, where this is up near modern material. So we have age against source. The Arctic systems have this terrestrial material, and it's very, very old. That's coming out into a lot of these coastal margins. And a lot of you have heard about this. If you haven't, it would be odd. A lot of this is our permafrost that we see that is now thawing in the Arctic, that has organic matter in it that was preserved thousands of years ago, fairly fresh. And that's one of the unique things about permafrost that's very different than material that's normally as old as it is. Most old material, the good stuff has been taken out. And so when it gets released, it's not very usable to microbes. Here, it's sort of the opposite, in that this very, very old material, 13,000 years old, 8,000 years old material is very highly available to microbes. That's a problem because when the microbes are exposed to it, they can eat it and produce CO2. So it's a positive feedback to the problem of global warming. One of the interesting things is that you can have, you can see the bioavailability here, right? The older the material, the more bioavailable. This was some work that we did. And one of the interesting things is that you can have insects or small multicellular invertebrates have very old ages, even though the animals themselves may be a few months old or a few weeks old. If you take their body and you date them, they can be 8,000 years old. So there are ducks floating around on ponds up there that have a radiocarbon age of 8,000 years old because of the material that's actually getting introduced to the environment. And that's why we published this paper called Old Before Your Time. That's kind of an interesting twist on it. This is a little bit hard to understand, but I'll try anyway. So what we were interested in looking at is how these rivers, this is the Colville River Basin up in northern Alaska. So as this material starts to thaw, the whole thing is permafrost. It's continuous permafrost. And here's the delta up here out in the Beaufort Sea. So what we're seeing here is that if you look at material that is in soils, deep soils, and that is out, makes it out to the shelf, it's very similar. So in terms of its radiocarbon age and its characteristics, we use this technique called ramp pyrolysis oxidation. It's a fancy name for linking the lability with the age. So essentially, we see this relatively labile material that's in deep soils, that's part of this permafrost, making its way out to the coast. And this is the primary mechanism of bank erosion. So if you look, when waters really start flowing in the spring, it's very, very dangerous to sample up in these systems, and you get lots of undercutting in these banks, and a lot of that essentially gets shunted out to the coastline. Again, why do we care? Because you're taking, it's a mechanism for getting this stored material inland out to the coastal environment pretty quickly. The reason why I say that, for those of you who know more about it, is that this is POC. The DOC that's associated with permafrost actually many times doesn't even make it to the coast because it's consumed in the river. So the POC transport makes it, but the DOC derived permafrost tends to be consumed in the river in many cases, not all. So now we'll go to another system. Again, I'm sort of moving around to these different environments, different latitudes, all of these in my mind being these sort of important coastal dynamic systems. This is a beautiful picture of the Wax Lake Delta, and you can see where it is in Louisiana. This was formed, again, by humans in 1941 when they built this outlet for flood control. And essentially what happened was that outlet has allowed a lot of material from the Atchafalaya River to be shunted out. All of this is sandy type material. So we know exactly when this delta formed. And because we have this, it's essentially a chrono sequence that we have here. So as you move from the inshore to the outshore, this is all older, and the newer material is out here, right? So you can look, you can see this is 38 years old, 26, 13. And this is what the environments look like. So near shore, older system has built up more vegetation. You move out, 26-year-old system, a little bit less, and then you get out to the sand flats here. So we said, well, we've been working on deltas that are thousands of years old all around the world. We have a delta, right, an embryonic delta, right before our eyes, and we can look at how organic matter is transforming in real time here. So we started looking at carbon stocks in different areas, and of course, the amount of organic carbon relative to sort of the surface area or the depth of it. You can see the height above sea level. Again, you get much more carbon burial in the older areas that have a lot more vegetation than out in the sandy areas. And again, that is also related to surface area. Again, it comes down to sandy material versus the more muddy material that's associated with vegetation. So you get a nice relationship with surface area as well. Remember I told you about some of the important factors that control burial. And I'll talk about one of those factors again. Here's where the iron comes in. So one of the other things is we found that the organic carbon in this delta, about 15% of the organic carbon that gets bound is bound to iron oxides. All right. So again, I won't get into the mechanisms of it for this group, but the more we explore different regions of the world, it's turning out that you can get up to 20 to near 30% of the carbon that gets buried in certain systems are linked with these iron oxides. All right, so sorption processes, things like that. And when we go a step further with the chemistry, we see that some of these ferrohydrites versus hematite, again, ferrohydrite forms from precipitation. And what happens is when it precipitates, essentially you trap DOC, and that's one mechanism, all right? Ferrohydrite we find is more with the precipitation mechanism, whereas hematite seems to be more influenced by sorption. So there are two ways organic matter can get attached. It can sorb, or it can be go from the DOC and get trapped as this mineral's precipitating. So there's two mechanisms, and that's another interesting twist on the redox environment, gradients in redox. So now I mentioned about fjords, and this was something we published back in 2015. It turns out that fjords are vary about 11% of the carbon production, carbon burial globally, which is sort of shocking, because when you really look at the total organic carbon in different oceanic environments, you can see that fjords are much smaller than the total continental shelf region. But if you normalize the area, you can see how fjords are so much higher than all these other systems because they have such a smaller footprint. There just aren't that many fjords globally compared to, much of the continental shelf. So we've looked at this in New Zealand has been a hot spot where we've looked at this, and you can see this is Fjordland, New Zealand, where we've looked across a gradient of fjords going from north to south. This is the steeper gradients, and it starts to get smaller, lower mountains away from the steep Southern Alps there. And essentially, again, you find that the fraction of organic matter coming in the steeper areas is much more modern. But when you get down to the areas where the topography of the system starts to drop, you start to get less of that fraction of bulk material. If you look at black, that's the bulk organic matter coming into the fjords. Don't worry about this. These are just biomarkers. But the point is you get this gradient. And what this is showing is that the steeper the fjords, the more rapid fresh material can get shunted to the bottom and stored. The less steep they are, the more it goes through that sort of gradual processing, and it's older by the time it gets to the bottom of the fjord, sort of like what I showed in the beginning with passive and active margins. The other thing, when you start to get up into places like Alaska, where you have fjords, some of them have these glaciers and some of them are not fed by glaciers. And essentially the general message here is very simple. If you look at the organic accumulation rate, don't worry about this. You just have non-glaciated and glaciated. You get a tremendous amount more of petrogenic material and glaciated material. That's organic carbon from rocks as the glaciers are bulldozing these materials into the fjord. The non-glaciated systems are mostly dominated by phytoplankton. So again, really active zones of burial. Now, one of the really interesting things here, this would be sort of the normal system of how these systems have been working with healthy glaciers or non-glaciated phytoplankton dynamics. Again, these are just some numbers here. Don't worry about that, but these are very, very high values. But what happens now in the Anthropocene is we're starting to take these tidewater glaciers and we're retreating them back. So the glaciers are retreating back. What does that do to what gets buried in fjords, right? So now you're opening up this transition area that the fjord was originally located here. Now you've opened up an area that allows for more residence time of material as opposed to dropping right in. You've also changed the bulldozing effect, right? And maybe what that means is we'll get more phytoplankton here than what was originally when the glacier was more active. So this is another really important thing in the Arctic that's changing. Most people have been thinking about permafrost, but the whole dynamics of where glaciers bury things in fjords as they start moving and retreating is another thing that's really been largely ignored. And if you look at places like Svalbard, these small islands owned by Norway, this has been a very active area of looking at how glaciers are retreating. This glacier here was here in 1948, 1962. You can see how this has retreated back, right? And a lot of these fjords, as they're retreating, they create these little deltas as these materials get deposited. So we knew of this delta that was formed during the retreat since the last glaciation in New Zealand. And we said, well, that's sort of a remnant of what's going to be occurring more in the Arctic, right? This is what's going to be left behind as these glaciers retreat in the Arctic, these sort of footprint deltas. And we said, let's just go there. We know a lot about these fjords and just see something about the carbon cycling on these sort of these footprints that will be forming compared to the way material normally enters, right? So again, you've got this footprint that prevents material from being shunted right in, and actually this platform. Well, essentially, I'm sorry, let me just go back a minute. So essentially what we see, just to get right to the point, is that a lot of the material before it enters the fjord here is really reworked and degraded compared to the material in the way these other materials enter the fjords in this more rapid shunting down these steep, shallow soil regions. These areas get about 7 meters of rain a year. So there's essentially many of the forests just wash into these deep fjords. That's quite different here. So again, this whole geomorphical dynamic of whether you have a platform or this steep gradient changes what gets buried and how it gets buried, all right? In Scotland, some of these fjords challenged even a lot of scientists who have been arguing for peatlands, and there's no doubt that peatlands store a tremendous amount of carbon. But if you really look at, and this happens to be sedimentary organic carbon, and this is sedimentary inorganic carbon in fjords, and then you look at the peatlands, okay, the fjords are actually burying more. Look at the units. The units here, this is an order of magnitude difference on this scale, all right? These are all the peatlands in Scotland, and these are all the fjords. And the peatlands have a much, much larger surface footprint. So again, these fjords have low oxygen, a rapid way to shunt material into the deeper portions, and a rapid way of storing. So my last few slides are essentially this mangrove marsh aquatic critical zone idea. And again, many of you know blue carbon's been in the news a lot, published a lot on it over the last few years in terms of its economic value. And again, the reason that these systems store so much carbon, and I think this is not mentioned enough, is because these are euxinic systems. If it wasn't for the sulfur cycle, you could easily argue that freshwater wetlands are just as important. All right. So the idea here is that sulfur cycle has pushed the methanogens down deeper. Whereas if you have a lot of burial you do have burial in freshwater wetlands as well, but the difference here is the sulfur cycle in terms of seagrasses, mangroves, and marshes. That's what's considered to be the blue carbon habitats. So to combine what we've been saying, carbon storage, and I was talking to you before about range expansion, a lot of you know that the mangroves are moving up. They've been moving up from Texas to northern Texas. They've made it into Louisiana. They're moving on both coasts in Florida, and they've already started to now make their way into parts of Georgia. All right? And black mangrove mostly, but we now are working up in parts of Apalachicola. I get my Atchafalaya and Apalachicola confused sometimes. But essentially, we're starting to even see red mangroves up in these reaches as well. And Derek Vaughan did some work. Some of you know of this work. And when you start looking at the interfaces, that is, there are areas now, and you can see up here, we worked on the West Coast and the East Coast of Florida. And these are two areas that have really well-established mixed habitats of mangroves and marshes. So you can find just mangrove, you can find just marsh, and you can find basically the transition zone. So if you look at carbon burial in pure marsh, pure mangrove, transition, so on East Coast, West Coast, it's the transition zones that bury or have this, I should say, this have higher stocks. This is not a rate. There's kilograms of carbon per meter squared over 38 centimeters. So that's interesting in itself. And again, people are finding that around the globe. It's not surprising that as you start bringing in woody material compared to grassy material, the decay dynamics are obviously very different. Even the root system is very different in terms of potential changes to redox. So that still needs to be explored. The other thing I'll mention is that what's also moving with these, this has been very plant-centric. What's also moving with plants are certain crab species that may have different burrowing depths. And we haven't been able to really get this as fully explored. We have a couple of folks that we were collaborating with at UF, and was trying to maybe sort of get that reintroduced again, where we can sort of follow up on that. But that's something that we're potentially interested in looking at. So that relates to that other thing that I mentioned earlier, that as not only plants move, but as organisms move, you start changing redox with different burrowing depths, right? So my final thing here is this sort of, this is something that many of you could sort of look at, sort of just a rehashing of things, but I think really in this paper that we published recently, we get into much more the importance of evolution and how that, I think, needs to be incorporated much more in the kinds of things we look at across these gradients. And again, in biology departments, they know this full well, and they have people working on ecological genetics and evolutionary genetics. But I just have found it to be very slow in being incorporated into a lot of biogeochemical work. And it's getting, certainly the open ocean people are on this with microbes and things, but I mean, even with metazoans, I think even that's something that needs to come into play with things like adaptation, depth of root zones, depth of mixing, and what comes along with sort of phenotypic plasticity versus real speciation as organisms adapt to different latitudinal gradients. So again, just a few bullets here. I'll just sort of put these up. Again, I think, as I just mentioned, I think this whole concept of mixing and redox and all of that needs to have much more linkage with the types of organisms, how they got there, why they're there, and how they adapted, I think, as opposed to just ignoring that. The deglaciation is going to really change the dynamics, the way you put ancient petrogenic material into the system. And what that means, with less turbid waters in terms of phytoplankton and regrowth of shrubs in these open areas now that are warming. What does that do to the soil erosion dynamics? So it's just changing tremendously. Totally nothing to do with permafrost, just that in itself. Again, this whole idea of the aquatic continuum, I think, as we continue to try to separate land use from climate change, is a tough one, right? As you start to look at changes in the erosion rates, is it just land use in agriculture, or how much of it is changing rainfall rates and things like that? And separating those are really, really tough, and something that continues to be a very difficult thing in these aquatic critical zones. And then again, as I just mentioned, I think, for me, in terms of what we look at in the coastal zone, we're starting to just see many, many more organisms move. Fiddler crabs used to never get past Cape Cod. Now they're finally into New Hampshire. People in New Hampshire never saw fiddler crabs in and around their marshes, and they're there. And guess what? Those marshes are being turned over in ways like they've never been experienced. What does that mean to carbon turnover? So just imagine that everywhere in different levels, right? So with that, I will stop.
Thanks so much, Tom. I think everybody here probably would be jealous of your frequent flyer miles. All the studies you showed us from New Zealand to the Arctic to Scotland and everywhere. It's really awesome. So we'll take some questions from the room, but while you're thinking what you want to ask Dr. Bianchi, I have one from YouTube. This is from Dr. Elliot White. He asks, how has modern agriculture, like drainage, shortcutting, excess nutrient loading, affected carbon storage and accumulation in old deltas, or I guess in coastal regions generally?
Yeah, and again, that's a perfect question, because it sort of hit on that a little bit at the end of the talk. David, should I stop sharing my screen?
I did. I stopped you, so
okay.
We're back.
All right.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah, sure. Again, what we're seeing is that you may start to see changes in C4 and C3 plant material that's making its way in the particulate load in rivers. So as you change upstream in, for example, the Mississippi River, we see this. You can take down core changes and you can see changes in levels of agriculture, and you can even track it to different regions and different time periods. So that's kind of been around for a while, because it's been going on so long and it's been such a dramatic change. So that's sort of an easy one to see. In terms of the actual dynamics and the rates of decay and things like that, that's a little bit different, but tracing it to certain, again, the C3, C4 is a little bit easier when you have some of the biomarkers and isotopic signatures and time in a core where you can relate things to certain events.
So you can see the signature, but I mean, you might have like two contrasting mechanisms where you have like nutrient loading increasing. I assume you increase the cycling rate of carbon, and then you also have this sort of quicker, perhaps, delivery because you of both inorganic and particulate and dissolved carbon just from drainage efficiency gains. So you've got more carbon and working it faster. So I guess I'll get confused, but do you think we're getting more burial or less burial at that point because you've got both the biogeochemical process as well as like the loading process are changing simultaneously?
Yeah, and the other thing, David, I mean, you're bringing up all the really important points that make it difficult, but the other thing is that the footprint of a lot of the deltas is disappearing. So usually where the storage footprint is, it's disappearing because of damming, and the damming's not bringing enough particles to the delta. So then when you start bringing in what happens not only in the river proper, but if you go to the delta itself, it's really hard to sort of look at that because the delta itself is eroding. and it's not storing the footprint in the same way that it did earlier. And so that's another really difficult thing in these areas.
All right, thanks. We've got a question from Yiyang, Calvin Kang. Go ahead, Calvin.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Bianchi. I'm just wondering, you mentioned the transitional zone of submarsh and mangrove being like higher in carbon bureau rates. So I'm wondering, like, with the range expansion, the transitional itself is kind of moving north, right? So I'm wondering, like, is it part of the data? Is it part of the leftovers from the carbon bureau from previous zone? For example, it could be used to be mangrove or salt marshes, but now being transitional zone stuff.
Yeah. No, that's a good question, and that's why you need to make sure that you take cores that are long enough to go back in time. I think one of the problems I've had with the blue carbon community is when they first started, because it was more by ecologists, plant people, is that they didn't really have a good handle on sediment dynamics and burial. What they were calling burial, less than a meter, is not something that you really can have a lot of confidence in. So you need to really be thinking about what's true burial and what's in this sort of transitory state, right? But you're getting into exactly what you're saying. If you go deep enough, you can even pick up some of the older coastal forest communities, even before it was marsh. I mean, if you go back deep enough. So you do have to be careful in terms of separating old coastal forest communities to when the marshes got there, and then now the mangroves are coming. And your point about how do you separate the contribution of the older marsh material that's still in the sediments where the mangrove roots are, you still have remnants of the marsh. And so we can separate that out. We can separate pretty much, again, with isotopic and biomarkers, you can sort of tease that out pretty well, where you start to see this mixture, and then you start to see that kind of getting faded and diluting as the mangroves get deeper rooted and you get this annual cycling of litter. But separating that is really important in terms of the older footprint versus the new.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we're past time, so let's give Dr. Bianchi a round of applause, either real or your little button there I'll give you some real applause. And I'll just end by saying I love having geologists or geological scientists present, because they love to say, you have to go back deep enough. All right. You don't say back far enough. You need to go back deep enough. I love that. So Tom, it was great to see you. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. And everyone, we will see you next week. Until then, be good to others and be good to yourself. We'll see you all soon.